Nazi scientists tested meth on soldiers, created super warriors who fought 3 days without sleep. April 8, 1940. The night over Berlin carried the clean, metallic smell of rain, and the Temmler laboratory windows shone like small squares of moonlight above the empty street. Inside, under a cone of glassy white, a young infantryman named Hans Müller stared at the second hand of a wall clock and didn't blink. He hadn't blinked much in 3 days. His jaw worked gently on nothing. His fingers tapped a code only he understood, and the pupils in his gray eyes sat wide and hungry, drinking in light. Dr. Fritz Hauschild steadied the slide on the stage and lowered his eye to the microscope. The blood looked oddly purposeful, crowded red cells coursing as if late for an appointment, a restless brightness to the plasma. He lifted his head. "How long has it been since you slept?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral like an engineer checking a gauge. 72 hours, Herr Doctor," Muller answered too quickly. He flexed his hands and smiled a small, brittle smile. "I could run to Paris." The room kept its secrets in the hum of the fume hood and the faint tick of glass against glass. On a tray lay a white tin, printed with spare modern lettering, Pervitin, a pharmacist's promise disguised as a cough lozenge. Hauschild turned the tin with 2 fingers, making the inked letters catch the light. For years, chemists had pursued alertness like a kind of engineered dawn. Now Berlin had packaged it, dosed it, named it, prepared to ship it by the millions. Temmler had put Pervitin into circulation in the late 1930s and watched it slip easily into German life. Students, typists, night shift workers, drivers on long gray roads finding that wakefulness could be swallowed with water and a shrug. In the Wehrmacht, the appeal was simpler still. Speed meant surprise. Surprise meant victory. The body was the bottleneck. Why not widen the pipe? Müller stood when asked, raised his arms, touched fingertip to fingertip with clinical precision. He recited numbers backward, then forward, then by threes, the cadence crisp, the breath shallow. When the doctor flicked the light off and back on, Müller didn't flinch. "Heart rate 140, the assistant said from the doorway, pencil trembling above a clipboard. "Regular?" The air smelled faintly of camphor and alcohol and wet wool. In the alley below, a tram rattled past, and the clock's hand slid over another minute it would never see again. Hauschild wrote, "Sustained vigilance, improved reaction time, no gross motor tremor. Patient subjectively reports invincibility." He paused on the last word, drew a line through it, and replaced it with euphoric confidence. Language could sand down truths into something publishable. Outside the lab, the general staff had already done the arithmetic. If a column could march through the night, and the next night, and the night after that, if tank crews could drive and never lose the edge dull sleep steals, then rivers would be crossed before defenders woke, and borders would become afterthoughts on a communique. In April 1940, a stimulant decree moved mountains of small white tablets from factory to field. More than 35 million doses in a season when Germany was learning to pronounce speed as destiny. The science had a genealogy older than the uniforms in the hallway. Decades earlier, Japanese researchers had pulled this chemistry from the spine of a plant and taught it to shine like crystal. Methamphetamine, sharper and more permeable than its gentler cousin amphetamine, stepped across the blood-brain barrier as if it owned a key. In 1919, Akira Ogata shaped it into a water-soluble salt that dissolved cleanly, quickly, efficiently, an engineer's dream of a drug. Berlin had simply found its wartime use. Hauschild looked at the soldier again. The boy's lips were chapped, his knuckles raw, his shadow blue beard 2 days old. Yet he stood as if someone had wound an invisible spring and forgotten where to place the off switch. "How do you feel?" the doctor asked, and Miller's answer came without a breath between syllables. "Awake," he said, "clear, fast, like the world has slowed down for me to move through it." The doctor made one more notation and closed the book. There are moments when history changes its gait. Sometimes it is a treaty, a speech, a gunshot. Sometimes it is a tablet dissolving on the tongue of a private who will be asked to drive a machine through a forest that maps had labeled impassable. In a few weeks, as columns rolled into the Ardennes and across the Meuse in a blur of steel and will, field medics would pass tins from hand to hand, and men would learn a lesson the chemistry had hidden in its shine. That borrowed hours charge interest. But on this April night, in the immaculate light of a Berlin lab, all anyone could hear was the steady, accelerated beat of a single heart and the whisper of a clock that no longer seemed to matter. Berlin, spring 1940. A city humming under blackout curtains, its streets disciplined and hungry for momentum. Posters promised victory through science, sleek rockets, synthetic fuels, the new chemistry of strength. In the center of it all, the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company turned out its white miracle tablets by the millions, stamped, sealed, shipped. They called it Pervitin, a name that rolled easily off the tongue, halfway between a vitamin and a verb. For civilians, it was sold as progress in a pill. Housewives were told it would make long workdays lighter. Students found it sharpened memory and stripped away fatigue. Truck drivers and factory laborers learned they could push through the night, trading sleep for performance. Even the army nurses chewed Pervitin chocolate during endless shifts. Germany had discovered how to stay awake, and no one wanted to close their eyes again. In the barracks and command centers of the Wehrmacht, the discovery became doctrine. The army had already reinvented warfare once with Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. But lightning burns out fast unless you feed it fuel. Speed was everything, not just mechanical speed, but human speed. Soldiers had to become the machines they drove. Pervitin offered exactly that. By April, the General Staff had requisitioned 35 million tablets. They arrived in small gray tins stamped with an eagle and the words "Nur bei Bedarf einnehmen," take only when necessary. The phrase was almost a joke. Once the pills reached the front, necessary meant whenever exhaustion whispered too loudly. Historians would later find the memos. One, signed by Oberst Heinz Guderian, read, "All Panzer crews are to receive Pervitin before extended movement. 2 tablets every 4 hours as needed to maintain operational effectiveness." Doctors who raised concerns were told to focus on results. And the results came swiftly. On May 10, 1940, German tanks rolled into the Ardennes, terrain the French High Command had deemed impassable. The soldiers inside those steel beasts had not slept in 2 days. By the 3rd, they were still alert, eyes bright, reflexes sharpened to a manic edge. The invasion plan depended on continuous movement. Fatigue would have broken the chain. But the men did not falter. They felt unstoppable. Letters home glowed with a kind of unnatural confidence. "I have driven for 70 hours, wrote one corporal. "My hands tremble, but my mind is clear. The pills make us gods." Pervitin, as it turned out, did not make gods. It made efficient predators. Brilliant for a moment, brittle forever. Behind the shimmering surface of victory, a quiet disaster was unfolding. Field medics began recording strange symptoms. Soldiers sweating through their uniforms in cold weather, heart rates spiking above 150, eyes twitching even in rest. Men laughed for no reason, then fell into despair so deep they begged to be shot. Commanders called it battle stress. In truth, it was chemical withdrawal. But in those first weeks of conquest, no one cared. The offensive through France moved with terrifying precision. The enemy barely understood what had hit them. In 6 weeks, Paris fell, and the headlines wrote themselves, "German science triumphs again." In Berlin, Hauschild read the reports with pride and a sliver of dread. He knew what 3 milligrams of methamphetamine did inside the brain, how it flooded synapses with dopamine, suppressing fatigue, magnifying focus, silencing fear. But he also knew the cost. Each high was an overdraft, each victory an IOU written against the body's future. The question was never whether Pervitin worked. It did. The question was how long before it stopped working. Before the soldiers, the scientists, the empire itself crashed under the weight of its borrowed energy. By late 1940, the miracle drug had become a silent addiction. The front demanded more. The Luftwaffe requisitioned 10 million doses for its pilots. Submariners carried it on missions that lasted months beneath the Atlantic. Temler ran its machines day and night. A nation was running on chemistry, an empire literally high on its own ambition. Somewhere in a bunker, a clerk filed Hauschild's latest report. Subjects remain alert for 48 to 72 hours with minimal fatigue. Side effects: agitation, euphoria, decreased appetite, insomnia. No fatalities observed. He underlined that last line, perhaps with a sigh of relief, perhaps because he knew it would not stay true for long. And in the weeks that followed, as Europe fell under the roar of engines and marching boots, no one in Germany asked the question that should have stopped them cold. What happens when an entire army forgets how to sleep? Before long, the answer would come, not in laboratories or ledgers, but on battlefields where soldiers' hearts began to beat too fast for victory. The summer of 1940 smelled of diesel, cordite, and triumph. Across Europe, banners unfurled and trumpets announced the new order. The world believed Germany unstoppable. But beneath the sheen of victory, another campaign was already underway. Silent, invisible, waged inside the bloodstream of its soldiers. The soldiers called them Wunderpillen, miracle pills, small white tablets that erased pain, fear, and exhaustion. They were handed out like ammunition, counted not by dose, but by necessity. A corporal in the Ardennes wrote, "They tell us to rest 4 hours every 3rd day, but no one sleeps. The tablets keep us moving. We drive until the stars blur." The Blitzkrieg had created an army that moved faster than thought. A weapon built not just of steel and gasoline, but of chemistry. For the first time in history, a modern army fought not only on supply lines of fuel and food, but of methamphetamine. In the Ardennes, tank crews drove 70 hours straight, crossing terrain the French believed impassable. Pilots of the Luftwaffe flew 2-day bombing missions without blinking. On the ground, the infantry, gray-coated, hollow-eyed, advanced through fog and shell fire, their boots cutting through mud and blood in rhythm with hearts hammering at double speed. Hauschild's miracle was working too well. Heinrich Böll, then a young soldier and later a Nobel laureate, wrote home, "I have not slept for 3 nights. yet I feel no fatigue. I see sharper, hear more clearly. It is as though time itself has slowed, and I am inside the space between seconds. But when the drug wore off, time came crashing back. By September 1940, field hospitals across France and Belgium began receiving strange cases, men trembling uncontrollably, whispering to themselves, hallucinating phantom snipers or invisible insects crawling under their skin. Some refused food, claiming it was poisoned. Others stared at their rifles for hours, then turned them on their own men. In one report, Gefreiter Karl Schmidt, a tank gunner, killed his loader in the middle of the night, shouting that the French are inside the walls. When the medic arrived, Schmidt's pupils were pinpoints, his pulse a violent drumbeat. His body contained 40 times the recommended dose of Pervitin. At Luftwaffe bases, pilots began crashing planes after missions, not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion masked by chemistry. "They die awake," wrote one doctor, "and the last thing they see is the sky still moving." Dr. Otto Ranke, head of the Institute for Military Physiology, warned the high command, "Pervitin grants short-term strength, but destroys long-term endurance. We are training soldiers to burn brighter and die faster." No one wanted to listen. The victories in Norway, Belgium, and France seemed proof that the pills were divine, and the Führer himself, restless, manic, demanding, set the example. "If one pill brings energy," he said once to Morel, his physician, "two will bring power." By 1941, Germany was preparing for its most ambitious campaign yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. The order went out for 55 million tablets. Soldiers joked that they could conquer Moscow on coffee and Pervitin alone. In the first days of the invasion, they seemed right. Wehrmacht divisions advanced 80 kilometers a day. Supply trucks raced to keep up. The Red Army reeled. Pervitin had turned fatigue into a forgotten word. But nature and chemistry had their own counterattack waiting. The Russian summer was hot, and the drug dehydrated them. The Russian winter was lethal, and the same drug that kept their hearts racing also narrowed their blood vessels, starving their limbs of warmth. By December, the men who had stormed across Europe were collapsing in the snow, their lips blue, their fingers black, their hearts fluttering like dying engines. Reports flooded back to Berlin. Frostbite and gangrene in 15,000 cases, many among those using Pervitin. Acute psychosis. Soldiers report hearing music where none exists. Cardiac arrest following prolonged use. Average duration, 6 weeks. Hauschild, sitting in his Berlin apartment, read the dispatches with a sickness deeper than guilt. He had once written that Pervitin extended the human limit. Now he understood the cruel precision of his own words. The limit had not disappeared. It had simply been postponed, and the debt was coming due. In field hospitals outside Smolensk and Minsk, doctors began to recognize the pattern. The same drug that had created tireless soldiers now made them incapable of rest. They trembled even in sleep, muttering orders, reliving battles. When rations ran low, they sold their boots or bullets for one more tablet. A nurse recorded in her diary, "They no longer fear death, they fear closing their eyes." The Wehrmacht had built a machine that could not stop. And like every machine, it was beginning to tear itself apart. Then, in the frozen trenches of 1941, under skies heavy with ash and the echo of distant artillery, the first collapse came. Entire divisions froze where they stood, not from the cold, but from exhaustion. Men who had once believed themselves invincible now stared blankly into nothing, hands shaking, hearts failing, whispering the same two words again and again. No sleep, no sleep. The drug that had fueled their conquest had finally stolen their humanity. December 1941. The Russian winter had closed its jaws around the German army. The snow lay like iron. Men who had marched on Paris now dug holes in the frozen earth, trying to light fires with hands too numb to strike a match. The drug that had once made them invincible now mocked them. It made their hearts race, even as their bodies froze. It whispered wakefulness into skulls already hollowed by exhaustion. In a trench near Smolensk, Gefreiter Hans Müller, the same volunteer from Temler's first experiment, sat with his back against the wall of ice. His eyes, once bright with chemical fire, now trembled in their sockets. The last tablet of Pervitin lay in his palm, the small white promise that had carried him across half a continent. He turned it between his fingers like a prayer bead. His comrade beside him, Otto Witt, coughed up blood and tried to smile. "Take it," he rasped. "Keep us awake until morning." Muller shook his head. "It doesn't help anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming." Outside, wind moaned through the shattered barrels of frozen rifles. From somewhere in the dark came the sound of a Russian soldier crying out, not in triumph, not in rage, but in pain. The voice rose and fell, human and terrible, then went quiet. For the first time in weeks, Müller felt something like clarity. Not the razor-edged focus of methamphetamine, but the slow ache of awareness. He looked at Otto, who had stopped moving, and realized that no pill could pull him back from that silence. That night, a German medic named Kurt Lehmann made his rounds. He had been assigned to collect the dying, to take their tags, their watches, their letters. He carried a small bag of morphine, a useless luxury in a place where men died faster than pain could be numbed. When he reached Müller's trench, he saw the young soldier staring into the snow. "Are you wounded?" the medic asked. Müller shook his head. "No, just tired." Lehmann crouched beside him and saw the pill still resting in his glove. "You should sleep," he said. "I can't," Müller whispered. "It's like my blood is shouting." The medic sighed. He knew the look, the twitch at the corner of the mouth, the pupils that refused to shrink. He'd seen too many like it. The war had created thousands of these men, eyes open, hearts sprinting, souls left behind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were 2 sugar cubes, contraband sent from home. "Here," he said, "try these instead." Müller blinked. "Sugar? It's not a cure," Lehmann said, "but it reminds you what real sweetness tastes like." For a moment, the absurdity made Müller laugh, a dry, cracked sound that startled them both. He put the Pervitin back into its tin and took the sugar. It melted on his tongue, small and ordinary and honest. He closed his eyes for the first time in 3 days. Lehmann stayed beside him, watching frost collect on the rim of the trench. He thought about the irony of it all, the empire that had conquered Europe, now reduced to men shivering in holes, guarded only by their ghosts. In the distance, artillery flashed, a dull orange pulse through the snow. But in this tiny pocket of stillness, 2 Germans had chosen not to fight, one against sleep, the other against despair. The medic pulled his coat tighter and whispered almost to himself, "We were supposed to be supermen. Look at us now, barely men at all." Historians would later overlook scenes like this, buried beneath the statistics of campaigns and casualties. But for those who lived it, this moment, when one man offered another a piece of sugar instead of a pill, was everything. Weeks later, Lehman was captured near Vyazma. His Soviet interrogator, a doctor himself, asked why the Germans had used such drugs. Lehman hesitated, then answered, "Because they wanted soldiers who wouldn't feel. But they forgot. Without feeling, you can't tell when you've gone too far." The Soviet doctor nodded quietly. "That's why we drink vodka," he said. "At least it reminds us we're still human." For Miller, the war ended 2 months later in a blizzard outside Rzhev. When his body was recovered in spring, a small tin of Pervitin was found in his pocket. Inside, the last tablet remained untouched. He had finally slept. The war had taken their strength, their purpose, their reason, but in the end, it gave them one last choice: to remember what being human felt like. The war had taken their countries, their ranks, their uniforms, but not their souls. May 1945. The sky above Berlin burned with the color of rust. Smoke hung low over the ruins, and the smell of cordite and decay clung to the air like a second skin. Germany had finally fallen, but the men who had fought its battles were already broken long before the surrender. In hospitals across the Reich, doctors faced a new kind of patient, not wounded, but wrecked. Soldiers who could not sleep, who trembled without reason, whose eyes darted like trapped animals. Their veins no longer carried blood and duty alone, but withdrawal and guilt. They were called Die Müden, the tired ones. But tired was not the right word. They were empty. At a makeshift medical ward in Munich, Dr. Otto Ranke, the same physiologist who had once championed Pervitin as the key to endurance, now moved from cot to cot, examining the consequences of his own theory. 1,000-yard stare, trembling hands, hallucinations that returned even after the morphine wore off. He kept notes anyway, perhaps out of habit, perhaps as penance. "Subject reports hearing commands during sleep," he wrote. "Subject believes heart has stopped, though pulse strong. Subject cannot differentiate between day and night. Cries for tablets." They had built an army of men who could fight without rest, and now they had to live without peace. In one corner of the ward, a former tank gunner named Otto Witt, the same soldier who once shared a trench with Miller, sat clutching a metal box. Inside were a few remaining Pervitin tablets, now gray with age. The nurses tried to take it from him, but he held on as if it were the only thing that still belonged to him. He whispered to no one in particular. "They said we'd win the world if we stayed awake. But no one told us what happens when the world stops moving." Outside, the Allies were cataloging the wreckage of Hitler's empire. In bunkers, they found crates of Pervitin stamped Wehrmacht Eigentum, property of the German army. In one, a British officer counted 20,000 tablets and wrote in his report, "It seems the Germans fought their wars on chemicals as much as on courage." The scale was staggering. 200 million tablets produced over 6 years. Soldiers, pilots, sailors, all wired into a machine that mistook insomnia for immortality. Meanwhile, in the Führer bunker, Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had been injecting his patient daily with a cocktail that included Pervitin, cocaine, and morphine. By the end, the Führer himself had become the ultimate addict, his mood swinging violently, his decisions growing erratic and suicidal. The same chemistry that had propelled his army had devoured its creator. When the war ended, Morell tried to flee Berlin, but was captured. During interrogation, an Allied officer asked him, "Do you understand what you've done?" Morrell replied, "I only gave them what they wanted. Energy." Energy. That word had once sounded heroic. Now it echoed like a death sentence. In the months following surrender, the remnants of the Wehrmacht drifted homeward, if they had homes left to return to. Trains carried them through a wasteland of ashes and hollowed-out cities. They arrived pale and trembling, looking less like conquerors than survivors of a plague. In one Red Cross camp near Nuremberg, Dr. Ranke visited to interview veterans for his post-war research. A young soldier approached him, thin as a shadow, and said, "Herr Doctor, will they give us more Pervitin in prison?" Ranke froze. "Why would you want that?" The soldier smiled faintly. "Because when I take it, I don't dream." That night, Ranke tore out the final page of his notebook and wrote a single line. "We created a war that never ends, one that continues inside the men who fought it." Across Germany, addicts filled the hospitals, the police stations, the churches. The miracle pill had outlived the Reich. Fritz Hauschild, the chemist who had first uttered the words, "We have created super soldiers," in that Berlin laboratory 5 years earlier, watched the newsreels of the trials at Nuremberg and understood his place in the chain. The generals had commanded armies. He had commanded molecules. Both had obeyed the same logic: more, faster, longer. One evening, he returned to the Temmler building, now stripped bare by Allied occupation. In his old lab, dust covered the tables where Pervitin once gleamed under the lights. He sat at the bench, stared at his reflection in the metal tray, and whispered, "Perhaps the drug worked too well. It kept us awake long enough to see what we became." He signed one last report, a confession rather than an experiment. The substance known as Pervitin enhances wakefulness, suppresses hunger, and temporarily eliminates fear. It also erases empathy, judgment, and mercy. I submit that such power cannot exist in human hands without destroying what is human in them. When he left, he locked the lab door behind him, but the sound of the key turning felt hollow. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. The war was over, but for those who had lived inside its chemical heartbeat, it never ended. The gates had opened, but many of them never truly left the camp of their own bodies. It was 1952, 12 years after that first white tablet dissolved on the tongue of a German soldier. The world had rebuilt itself on the ruins. Berlin was no longer a capital of conquest, but of rubble and reconstruction. Cranes rising where banners once hung, children playing where tanks had burned. The war had ended, yet its ghosts remained, some buried under stone, others still walking inside the men who had survived it. Dr. Fritz Hauschild lived quietly now in a small flat on Knesebeckstrasse. His hair had turned silver, his hands still trembled, though not from age alone. On his desk sat a faded tin, the last box of Pervitin he ever kept, its label worn but legible. For fatigue, 1 tablet as required. Sometimes he would pick it up, feel its weight, then set it down again, as though measuring the distance between science and sin. He had testified at the denazification hearings the year before. The Americans called him the father of the Blitzkrieg pill. They asked whether he had understood what he was creating. He answered truthfully, "No, I only understood it afterward." When they pressed him to describe the effect, he said, "It made men faster than conscience." The tribunal room had gone silent. Now, in the quiet of post-war Berlin, He walked to work at a modest research clinic, studying the effects of sleep deprivation. His subjects were factory workers, nurses, students, ordinary people. He never mentioned methamphetamine again. Yet some nights, when the tram stopped running and the city fell still, he could hear echoes of engines, the hum of a machine that had once moved faster than time. That spring, a letter arrived with foreign stamps. It came from a veterans hospital in Hamburg. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a shaking script. Dear Dr. Hauschild, my name is Otto Witt. I was one of the soldiers who took part in your trials. I wanted you to know that I am still alive. I work at the docks now. The doctors say my heart is weak, but I can still feel it beat. Sometimes I still dream that I'm marching. Sometimes I still wake up afraid to sleep again. But I stopped taking the pills. I buried the last one by the river Elbe. I thought you should know that something human survived it after all. Oh, Witt. Hauschild read the letter twice, then a third time. He placed it beside the old Pervitin tin on his desk and stared at both for a long while. Finally, he opened the window. The air outside was cold, fresh, unmedicated. Somewhere in the street below, a child laughed, a small, ordinary sound, but to him it felt like forgiveness. He whispered, "You were right, Otto. Something human survived." That night, Hauschild walked to the River Spree. The water reflected the city's new lights, soft, diffused, almost tender. He took the tin from his pocket, turned it once in his hand, then dropped it into the current. It sank without a sound, leaving only ripples. He stayed until the water smoothed again, until the ripples disappeared, as if the river itself had chosen to forgive what the war had done to the world and to the men who had lived through it. Decades later, historians would call Pervitin the chemical engine of Blitzkrieg. They would write of strategies, battles, and numbers, of millions of tablets, millions of lives. But none of them would mention the quiet nights after the guns fell silent, when the survivors lay awake in dark rooms, hearts racing for reasons they could no longer name. Because long after the war was over, Germany remained a nation that could not sleep. And somewhere, perhaps in a hospital or a small apartment like Hauschild's, an old man would wake from a dream, touch his chest, and whisper to himself, still beating. They had come home with nothing, no victory, no glory, no absolution, except the fragile proof that humanity, even poisoned and broken, can still find its pulse. And you, where are you listening from? In your room, on a train, or somewhere far from the echoes of that war? Because somewhere, under the hum of your own sleepless night, those hearts are still beating.